All right, welcome to the 1000 Hours Outside podcast. My name is Ginny Yurich. I'm the founder of 1000 Hours Outside and back for a second time. I'm so excited. I've been excited since the last time we talked because this book was on the horizon. It was a ways out still, but it's here now. Ethan Kross, author of Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You. Welcome.
Ginny, it's so good to be back. I've been looking forward to coming back since our last conversation, and you'll pardon my somewhat raspy voice. I've been talking talking too much about
Oh
stuff
my
over the
gosh,
past week and a half, but it's a delight to be here.
you just got home. So, what an honor to get this bit of your time. You've been touring. I've just been seeing picture after picture after picture. This is such a big problem. It's a problem for myself. How do we manage our emotions so that they don't manage us? It gives us a better quality of life. And you wrote a phenomenal book called Chatter. And I mean, I've taken so many of those concepts, like, that you talk to yourself in the third person and all these little tweaks that you can do really change your life and immediately. So I
Yeah.
just found that book to be so fascinating and life-changing. And same thing with this one.
Oh,
You are
well.
phenomenal with the toolbox, and here's what you can do. But I'd love to start here. I interviewed a woman this year named last year named Dr. Edith Eger, who had survived the Holocaust like your grandma Dora, and almost didn't survive. I mean, right at the very end, I mean, she's kind of on death's door when she gets rescued out of there. I mean, it very easily could have tipped the other way. So you talk about your grandma. It's really, really interesting about how some people have gone through the biggest atrocities that you could ever really imagine. And then they seem to come out and still build this good life. And I love that you frame the book in her story and you talk about her throughout it. And you talk about how I mean, she lived in the woods, she gets betrayed, they're hardly eating. And what I've always wondered, and I've never asked anybody, is
Oh, here we go.
well, do you think that they had a sense that it would end at some point? That's what I've never really understood. It's like you're in this survival for, for months, for years in this survival situation. You're not getting in news, like how we get in all the news all the time. You're not getting any of that. You're in a concentration camp. You're living in the woods off the land and in hiding and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, how do you find the will to survive if you don't even know if it's going to end at all?
Well, we do know that human beings are amazingly resilient, and we can find meaning even the worst of circumstances. One of my favorite books of all time was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And he was actually also a Holocaust survivor, and he writes this account of how, despite facing terrible atrocities of the sort that my grandmother experienced too, he was still able to cling to some semblance of hope that he might be able to make it, and he went on to make it and lived a very rich life after, rich in terms of meaning and purpose. So I think you can always find that meaning. But your specific question about my grandmother, you know, what did she think in terms of when it would end? I wish I knew, but she never told me. And in fact, that was that's a big theme of this book, right? That one of the reasons I started the book with the story of my grandmother, and very narrowly surviving the Holocaust after seeing her family be slaughtered, was as a kid growing up with her and being exceptionally close with her. I spent every day after school in her house, like while my parents were working. I would ask her to tell me about her experience. I would have questions like the one you just raised, and she would consistently deflect them, those questions I would ask. She would not go there. The only time she would really talk about her experience was one day a year when there was a locally organized Remembrance Day event. And on that day, she would get up at the podium in the congregation where those events were held, and she would just let it go. And but that was it. And I've always found that so puzzling because, on the one hand, she absolutely avoided talking about this experience, except for that one day a year. And I had been raised, Ginny, I'm curious if this is true of you as well, but like when I was brought up, like my parents told me, you don't avoid things. If you've got a problem, face it head on, deal with it, get to the bottom, move on. And there is research which shows that chronically avoiding problems can be harmful. But here's my grandmother avoiding, and she actually has this like wonderful life in the end. Like she came here, she had nothing. She ended up having a family, working hard, owning a home, all this great stuff. But she was avoiding like crazy. So how does that actually work? And in the book, one chapter actually talks about what I call the myth of universal approach, which is this. It's a myth.
You're fine.
It's a myth because we have this idea that you should always approach your problems. And if you look at the research, what we find is actually being strategic and being flexible can actually be useful at times. So sometimes, like focusing on the problem, then taking some time away can be really, really taking some time away from an issue and then coming back can be useful. So I think it's really important for people to understand that we have the ability to approach and avoid things for a reason. Both serve their purpose in different at different times, and we want to be sensitive to when those different forms of coping might be helpful.
I found that to be very eye-opening because same as you, it's like you always hear that like, well, and this thing happens, and so then you go to therapy and you talk through it, and here's your grandma. I mean, we're talking about, I mean, maybe you get bullied at school, or you have these different, your maybe your parents split up, or these different things, and you go to counseling and that type of thing. But here's your grandma escaping out of windows and being ambushed, and you said it sounds like it's out of a movie, and it really did. I mean, she's a kid and she's escaping and running through the woods, and yet she didn't go to therapy. Like you had said, it wasn't even sort of recognized as a thing that people should do at that point. And yet she was such a wonderful grandmother. And she would always have this food. You wrote, I haven't eaten at a Michelin star restaurant that could compare with, the food that she made. She was like a second mom. She showed up every day and made it known that she loved me. So I love the twist here that maybe all these things that you've heard might not be correct for every single situation. You said you became an observer of emotion. Do you feel like your life's work stemmed from that, or were there other factors?
Well, that was certainly, I think, a big part of it, right? This curiosity that developed early on um, about her life and about how she managed. I remember thinking throughout my childhood about if I were in her situation, how could I manage that? Like, um, there was some turbulence in my life growing up, but nothing of the sort where I saw my family slaughtered, like basically right before my eyes, and I was homeless for years, living in the woods, not knowing when I might be killed or betrayed from one day to the next. I mean, what kind of existence is that? And what kinds of skills does one need to possess in order to be able to live through that and not just live through it, but also like move on with their life after and thrive. And so those were curiosities. And if I look back at the last 25 years of me doing research now, in many ways, I'm doing research to satisfy those curiosities. But I want to go back to something you said before because it was a big goal of the book, right? So my grandmother's story, and as you know, because we've spoken before, I think stories are so useful for sharing tools in science because they bring those tools in science to life. So whenever I write books, I'm always trying to see what are the real world accounts that illustrate how the tools I want to talk about play out. Like how do they actually work outside the lab? One goal, though, in putting together different stories for this book was to highlight the myths that exist surrounding how we manage our emotions because we've been searching for solutions to manage our emotions for a really, really long time. And in our quest to find those solutions, we've been led astray often because we hear things about what is good for us. And then if you look at the science, what we learn is that, in fact, those things we've heard aren't so good for us. And so we've touched on one of those myths already, which is this idea that avoidance is always bad. It's absolutely true that chronically avoiding things across the board is not good for you. There's a lot of research which shows that. But what we also know is that being flexible can be very helpful. So if I get into a fight with my wife and I'm the one who caused the fight, I might be really motivated to resolve it because I don't like being in an argument and I feel bad about maybe something I did to screw up. It happens on a regular basis. So I don't like doing that. Um, I don't like feeling that way. But what I've learned is sometimes actually the best way to resolve those tensions is to take some time away from them. Like give it a couple hours or even a day or two to simmer down and then come back to it. I mean, how often have you found, Ginny, that you get triggered in some way, anxious or angry or even sad? And in the moment that it happens, it feels all consuming, suffocating. But if you take a little time away, you come back to it, and you can either think about it from a new light or you come back to it and find, where's the problem? I can't even find it because this is inconsequential right now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it kind of dissipates. And I think I felt like I don't have a lot of strategies, but like sometimes you have a strategy that you use in your life and then you read a book like yours and it sort of confirms. But if we've been in upheaval, major upheaval in a situation here or there, and it could be all consuming, I've used the strategy of giving myself a time frame when I can think about it.
Right.
So, because I've got a parent or I've got to work, so you just can't be consumed all the time. So, I would say, okay, from 9:30 to 10 at night, I'm going to allow myself to stew about this problem, but not right now. And if it would come up, I would say I'm saving it for 9:30. And so often, like you write in the book, it just dissipates.
Yeah. In fact, so that's in part what my grandmother did with giving herself this time that she was
Yeah.
able to deal with it once a year. But what's interesting about what you just described, like I'm going to give myself 15 minutes at 5 o'clock to just indulge myself however much I want with this problem. I've tried that myself sometimes, and what I often find is then I get to 5 o'clock and I don't even do it because I
Yeah,
realize,
because
oh,
you're
I
not
didn't
thinking
I didn't
about it.
have to. But compartmentalizing it in that way to say I'm gonna get to it. I'm not gonna not get to it. I'm just gonna put it off a little bit. It just sometimes works magic, and that magic is not magic, it's time. We know that all emotion or nearly all of our emotional experiences fade with time. You've experienced this millions of times in your life because you've experienced millions of emotional reactions and they get triggered, and then as time goes on, they tend to fade. So that's one way that this strategic avoidance can help. That actually raises that brings up another tool I talk about in the book about how you can mentally time travel, and it breaks another myth, right? So the other another big myth is you should always be in the present.
Eh,
If things are going bad, like focus on the here and now, focus on your bodily sensations. That can be helpful for sure, but it's not like you can't. Like traveling in time in your mind is bad for you. It can actually be good for you. So one way it can be good for you is to think about how are you going to feel about this problem tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. What that does is it speeds up your ability to benefit from the passage of time. And here's how this works. We've just agreed, and I think most listeners would agree with this, that most of our experiences fade with time. Well, when you're in the midst of it, you lose sight of that because you zoom in on the awfulness. When you jump into your mental time travel machine, you say, how am I going to feel about this next week? It automatically makes accessible this idea that you've lived so many times, which is, oh, by next week it probably will have gotten better. And that highlights the instability of what you're going through. And that gives you hope because you know when it will end. To go back to that first question you asked. You can also, I'll just slip this in there. You can also travel back in time to help you. And this is where my grandmother helps me all the time. When I'm struggling with something that feels really big and challenging, and it's the first part of it's the subtitle, right? Like when your emotions are managing you rather than the other way around. I jump into my mental time travel machine. I go back to 1943 and I spend some time with my grandparents in the frozen Polish woods. I don't spend a lot of time with them there. I don't need to. What spending just a little bit of time with them back then does for me is it makes clear, wow, circumstances could be much, much worse than they are now. Even though things may not be great right now. My entire family wasn't just killed, and I'm not homeless, not knowing who's going to betray me. That is a really powerful way of broadening our perspective. And that's something that I think all of us can do because we all have our own personal experiences that we can use to broaden our perspective. Other times in our life that might have been worse than what we're dealing with now. Or if that doesn't feel true of us in the moment, given what we're experiencing, we have familial or cultural experiences we can lean on. And so that's another myth that you can bust, that we should always be in the moment.
And you end up with this toolbox. And you said your grandma Dora's toolbox, different than your toolbox. But what you do and what you've done in both books is you give a whole bunch of them. There's just a
Yeah.
ton of tools that you could choose from. I think that perspective shift, and like you said, it doesn't work for every situation. But I had read somewhere one time where it said, at any moment, at any given moment, you're within 20 miles of a hospital full of people who would gladly trade places with you. There's this perspective shifts, like you said, your time traveling back to, World War II, and it changes your perspective on maybe what seems like a big deal may not be as big of a deal as it actually is. And in some cases, things are a really big deal. So that's why you're saying it's like it shouldn't be this universal blanket thing. There's variability
Exactly.
here. Find the
Exactly.
tool that works for you at that particular time.
And
Yeah.
no, I'll just punctuate. That's if there's one point I hope people take away from the book, it is that there are no one size fits all solutions to manage your emotional life. And I think endorsing that idea does more harm than good. I think of being emotionally fit, if you will, a lot like being physically fit. How do you get there? You do lots of different things. And the things that I do are different from the things that you do, and the things that my best friend does. And that's okay. That's how this all seems to be working. And you could even change up your gym routine from one day to the next and still benefit. That also seems to be true about emotional fitness.
Yeah, and you even say that we don't even feel emotions the same way as another person. There's variability in that. Another myth is that the bad emotions or the negative emotions are bad. But you're like, no, envy can, give you that little bit of push to work harder, or regret can help you avoid repeating mistakes. Guilt can prompt you to make amends. Anger helps you respond to a threat. Fear compels you to act. So just a lot of myths that you are exposing in this book that allow people to think through it, and they make sense. They make sense. This is really important because you say being able to manage emotions predicts a lot about our lives. So this is an incredibly important book. People were coming up to you on your last book tour, crying. You said it was every type of person. It's an elite athlete. It's a CEO. It's a mother. It's a farmer. All these people are coming up to you on your last book tour. They're crying. They're struggling to manage their emotions. And this matters because it predicts a lot about how your life is going to go. So one of the things I loved, one of the tools was leveraging sensory experiences. And I love it because when you go outside, there are a lot of sensory experiences. And I do think that that helps with emotional health. It helps with mine, it helps with our kids. But in particular, you told this story about a song on the radio and how just music can do that, but people don't, they know it, but they don't really use it.
That's right. That's right. So this is true, by the way, not just of people, but also quote unquote experts on the topic like me, which is a story that I share in the book. I've been listening to music my entire life. MC Hammer, You Can't Touch Us was my first cassette tape. I was 5 years old. Loved it. Um, and I never really stopped to think about how I could strategically use music as a tool to shift my emotions up until I had this experience with my daughter that she was in a bad mood. It was before a soccer game. She was bumming me out. We're driving to soccer. She's got a scowl on her face. And then one of my favorite songs comes on the radio, Journey's Don't Stop Believing. Please don't judge me for admitting that. And, I love that
Great
song.
song.
And I start jamming out, right? I'm bopping my head. I'm singing along. I'm leaning into it. And, to get some rise out of my daughter in the back seat. But normally when I do that, the response I typically get from my daughter is just like almost a disgust facial expression, like, leave me alone. You're so embarrassing. Why can't we have a car with tinted windows so no one can see who I am? But in this case, she's getting into it, right? She's bopping along and humming, and we had a great day after that. And that experience really um, got me to think about why is music and our senses more generally such a powerful tool, and are people availing themselves of this tool. And so we actually did some research, or a lot of research on this in my lab. First thing to know is like when I say sensation, music is a form of a sensory shifter. What am I talking about? Well, we have all of these senses, sight, sound, touch, smell. And what they function to do is allow us to detect information from the world outside and bring it into um, our minds. And so, like I describe it as, imagine having like satellite dishes mounted all over your body, and they're different kinds of dishes that are all tuned to different kinds of information. But you're trying to gather all this information so that you can optimally navigate the world. And one of the things that's really important for taking that information in and then navigating the world is to know if it's good or bad for you. So, sensory experiences are very closely linked with emotions. That should come as no surprise to folks, right? Um, Scent's a great example here. You brush up against someone who hasn't showered in 3 weeks, they have really bad stinkiness, official term. You're going to have an emotional reaction. You brush up against someone who smells great, that's going to be positive. Pleasant tasting food versus foul tasting food, and so forth and so on. And so, senses, they function to shift our emotions. And the question is, are you strategic when you are suffering? Do you go to your senses to push your emotions around? We ask people, last time you were anxious, angry, or sad, what did you do to move your emotions around? Only between 10 and 30% reported using music as a tool. Despite in other work, close to 100% of people say the reason why they listen to music is they like the way it makes them feel. So the senses are just a tremendously unappreciated tool that can effortlessly shift your emotions around. Lots of people think emotion regulation is hard work. Sometimes it is, but it doesn't always have to be. And I think music is a great example of that. Now, you mentioned nature. We know that the benefits of nature on mental health and well-being are quite robust. It exerts a positive influence. One of the things that nature does for us is it allows us to restore our limited attention. You go for a walk in a beautiful, safe, natural setting, and if we measure people's like cognitive capacity, so to speak, like how much information they can keep in their head at any given moment in time, people are much more cognitively capable at the end of the walk than before. What's going on there? Well, there are lots of things in nature like sight, sound, smells, sensory experiences that capture our attention. So you start the walk, you're worried about something, and then you're in the safe, natural setting. And what people often find happens is their attention gently drifts onto their surroundings. They're not really like focusing super hard on the trees, like the species and how old it is and things like that. They're just taking it in through the senses, and that helps us restore. So nature is a great example of a kind of sensory bomb, if you will, like a sensory cocktail. It's pulling on multiple levers at once.
These are such important things to be made clearly aware of because when you're in that spot, like I even feel this way when I get sick, and I've got a midwife that lives in Ann Arbor, and she will be like, well, have you taken oregano or whatever the thing is? Like, well, no. Because sometimes I think when you're down and out and you're in that spot, you almost just kind of stay down and out and you don't really do anything. And I think the same can be true here when you're wallowing in different emotions and you're struggling. But just to be clearly made aware that, look, turn on some music that you like, or go take a walk, or, use some things, bake some cookies and you like that smell. Our ability to see, taste, touch, hear, and smell act as emotional levers. I see my car radio as an emotion regulation machine. You even talk about touch, that our neurobiology is almost instantly changed by touch. Person to person touch and even self-soothing touch affects emotions within milliseconds. So this is your thing, Ethan. You've got the shifts, which in both books, Chatter 2, you've got them that can change things so rapidly.
So
It's
it
not for
does.
everything, but
That's
it's
right.
for a lot.
That's right. And people often ask me if I'm like if I ever get stuck, having some trouble managing my emotions, yeah, at times, but what I'm really good at is I know what these tools are. So I reach for them, and most of the time, it does help me shift really, really fast to down-regulate those negative emotions and shorten the amount of time I spend in them. Um, just to kind of lean into what you said a beat further, what's also interesting about some of these senses is we have this kind of intuitive understanding that they might affect our emotions, but we leverage them in the wrong way, and sometimes that can get us into trouble. And this is where like knowing about how these things work, I think, is so useful. Like, to use the gym metaphor again, if you go to the gym, you could have a sense that the chest press and the bicep curl machine are going to do you good. But if you don't know how to use it, it could get you in trouble. So let's take music. Like, a lot of people have had the experience that when they're sad, they actually find themselves wanting to listen to music, but they don't listen to happy music to make them feel better. They actually put on some depressogenic music, like Chicago, Adele, like songs that make them feel even more glum, pushing you deeper into the experience. And if there's value you are deriving from staying in that sad state, and there can be, to be clear, value from sadness, it helps us make sense of loss, fine, keep doing it. But if your goal is to feel better and you find yourself listening to the sad music, now you're engaging in a behavior that's contrary to your goal. And so I always like to point that one out because a lot of people have had this experience of I'm feeling bad. Let me just listen to music to let me
Watch
sink
this really
deeper into
sad
this.
movie. Yeah, right.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Hey, if it works for you, great. But if that's not your
You got
goal,
you got to
don't
listen to
do it.
Journey.
That's right. Well, you
Put
got to
on
be
your Journey.
careful which Journey song you
Yeah, right,
select.
right.
Turns out Journey can push you in both directions.
Yeah, you gotta be choosy. And you even talked about someone baking bread, super busy. Like, but he said the minute he put his hands in the dough and you've got that smell, it's the whole thing. His worrying thoughts and emotions start to settle. So, I mean, I think for me, it's like starting to create a list of the things that really help and making sure that I prioritize those. And if I get in a slump, I use those tools. You said something really interesting when you were talking about going to your daughter's soccer game. You said she was bumming me out. And that was actually something that I wasn't expecting as a parent. So you have kids when they're little, they're having tantrums. One of our kids would want to eat pizza, but she would want it to be pepperoni pizza, but you had to take the pepperonis off. But she wouldn't eat cheese pizza. And it was a whole thing. So you can't get her cheese pizza. She wants to have pepperoni pizza. You take the pepperonis off. And she would have a tantrum. You know, you have these little nuances with little kids. They
Yeah,
have these tantrums and then they kind of grow out of them. There's no more tantrums. And then they maybe hit these tween teen years and they just have moody days, like how anybody has a moody day. And I was not prepared for like how much that would affect my emotions.
yeah.
You know, I've been driving with my kids and they've been all down. I'm like, oh my gosh. like, like, like I have to get it to stop because it's like really affecting how I feel. So can
Well,
you talk about emotional contagion?
yeah. I mean, emotions are contagious. They spread like wildfire, and in many ways, the emotions do spread that fast. Um, there's studies which show they spread within seconds, which is why, if I ever find myself in situations where someone in my team is displaying emotions that are maybe like stirring up other folks in the wrong direction, I try to intervene really fast. Why does this happen? Well, other people are rich sources of information for helping us understand what's going on in the world. And Ginny, one of the things that our brains are constantly doing all the time, even when you're not aware of it, it's happening in our unconscious, is constantly trying to understand our circumstances. Because first and foremost, that is relevant to our survival. I need to know what is the safety level of where I am? What is the mood? Because all that information affects how I should behave. And so we're constantly referencing other people to see how they feel about things. Because we're a social species and we've learned over time that other people are often like a pretty good source of information about how we should feel when it's not clear how we should feel about something, right? And
Yeah.
so you're just so used to looking to others for an emotional cue that we do it unconsciously. And that's in part why the emotions can spread so unbelievably fast.
Yeah, I felt it. And then I'm like, I need it to stop. So I think that having those emotional levers and teaching your kids about them is helpful for like the whole family unit. And you throw on some music that you like or something like that. Okay, when you notice that this is happening on your team, so people are listening in, maybe they're a business owner. We've talked about having employees. Our company isn't big enough to have employees yet, but I don't know how well I would do at that. I have no idea how well I would do at being a boss or managing different people's situations. When that starts to happen and you say you intervene, what do you do?
With my
So
team,
like
with
if yeah,
someone
if
on the
something's
team.
happening with your team and you
Oh,
notice things are
well,
kind of sliding downhill.
well, there are a couple of ways that I intervene. First, I'm usually somewhat indirect. I try to, um, shift the emotional pulse of the group and of that individual. I might try to, hey, what are you excited about? If it's a group setting, what's going well, right? Like, and if they're really upset about something, I try to get to the bottom of what is upset to diffuse that. So, and if that doesn't work, then, I have to take more extreme action to intervene. But I'm always sensitive to whether there is someone in a group that is consistently bringing the rest of the group down. And if that is happening, then I'm trying to address that in the ways that I just described. But more broadly, Ginny, I want to go back to the family unit, and how knowledge of what we're talking about today can be so incredibly helpful. So I spend one of the final chapters of the book talking about culture, and I describe culture as the air we breathe. It's all around us. We're soaking it up all the time. And I genuinely think it's one of the most powerful tools we have for shifting other people's emotions, including teaching them how to shift their own emotions. So we use this term culture a lot, but what does it actually mean? Culture culture consists of the values and beliefs a group cares about, right? And so you're giving those values and beliefs as the leader of your family or the co-leader of your family. You're in a position to give your kids specific kinds of values and beliefs. So, like in our family, we believe that all emotions are good for you. Even the bad ones, they serve a function at times. I'm giving my kid that belief so that when they find themselves experiencing a little bit of anxiety about an upcoming exam, they recognize that that's actually adaptive, that response. It's motivating them to study. It's not something they need to like worry endlessly about. I'm also giving them a belief about the value of emotion regulation and the importance of being able to manage their emotions. I'm conveying to them that there are no one size fits all solutions, that the things that mommy and daddy benefits from are not the things that you do. And that there are lots of tools you can use. So right here, I'm now giving them this framework for thinking about how to manage their emotional lives. And I'm also giving them those tools. So the other thing that cultures do for their constituents, they give them values and beliefs, but they also give them like a jumpstart tools to help them live those values and beliefs in their lives. So I'm teaching my kids about this stuff in a mostly not obnoxious way, right? Like, we're not having boot camp every night on here are the 7 ways to manage your emotions or 17. But I might at dinner time tell them about a really cool thing that we learned in the lab or an
Mm.
idea that I'm working on in a presentation. And so I'm putting it out there for them to consume. I'm not targeting them with that knowledge. But I really do think we all have the opportunity to shape the cultures that we're a part of. And what what is more important to shape than the emotional lives of the people we care about?
And there's a lot of teachable moments because you wrote emotions are not an infrequent experience. We are in a near constant state of emotionality 90% of the time. So there's a
Isn't that
lot of
wild? Yeah.
opportunities, yeah,
Yeah,
to talk about it.
90%. So like just think about that for a second. Almost 90% of the time or 90% of the time that we're awake, research shows that we are experiencing some kind of emotion. That's when we're awake. The research didn't get into the emotions we experience when we're sleeping. That's a trickier thing to measure. But if I'm generalizing from my own experience, I could tell you there's a fair amount of time I spend dreaming, and those dreams are filled with emotions too. So emotions are what it's all about. They're just part of who we are. They make life, both worth living and sometimes it makes life really hard to deal with. And so I think we need to be spending a heck of a lot more time educating ourselves about how to better manage our own emotional lives and helping those we care about, like our kids and our colleagues, do the same.
I really did love what you said about your team because I think that a lot of people can relate to having different work situations throughout their entire life, starting in teen years, where you're almost always, well, I guess things are different these days, but when I was growing up, it's like you're almost always working in a setting with other people. And there's often a time where you're like, if only that one person, wasn't here. And
One
so to
one person can really make things challenging, and being aware of that, I think. And I think a lot of us have had this experience,
right.
but I know that it could sour the well within seconds. So it enhances the urgency with which you intervene.
Yeah, so I like that. I think it shows care for the group as a whole if you are the one that's in charge, if you are just aware of that. And that would be similar to if you're in a family, right? If you're the parent and well, I would think about it like we have 5 kids. So, I
Wow,
mean, if one
amazing.
sours the well for everyone else, I mean, th those types of things happen. So to me, it gives me the mindset of to be on the lookout for it. Or if you're at a big family reunion, that type of thing. And if it's, your child is the one that's, causing the emotional contagion, that you can be the one that's ready and willing and able to try and help them and use those emotional levers. So I thought that's super interesting. That's not in the book. So that is a bonus that you're using that with your team.
Yes.
And I think that's a really practical thing when we're in positions of, authority or, parents or teachers or whatever. I mean, what if you're in a classroom? Oh my goodness, does that happen a lot? If
Oh
you're the one
yeah,
that's guiding the
absolutely.
class of students, sure.
It can happen in any group context.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I love about these tools that I talk about in the book. They are for the most part domain general, meaning they're not restricted to a specific context. You can use them at home, at work, for lots of different kinds of issues.
Yeah. So good. And when you talked about culture, I really liked the part that you talked about AA. I just read a book called The Fix by this man named Ian Cron, and it's all about how AA, like um, he had been a drinker and AA helped him, but he didn't really dive too deep into it. And then like 20 years later, he ended up like with substance abuse, like taking different painkillers and things like that.
Hmm.
That would be called some substance abuse, right?
If abused, well, I mean,
If abused, right?
if it meets the criteria,
Because alcohol is
sounds
also
like it.
is substance abuse, but
It
if
could
you're
be a form
taking
of substance abuse. Yeah.
could be a form, yeah. Okay, so that's a situation. It sort of shows up in a different way, and he did a more deeper dive into the AA the second time, and then he writes this book. And I've always wondered about it. There's the 12 steps. You hear about the 12 steps. You see people's lives are changed, and a lot of it has to do with emotions. Like what I said that I tend to be addicted to is overeating. So there's a lot of things that you can be addicted to. And what happens is like you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. What tips you over is an emotional disturbance often.
Yeah.
And you wrote in this book, people don't go to AA because drinking is their problem. They go because drinking is their solution.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so powerful because it's saying it's the emotions often that are tipping you into this behavior that you don't really want to be a participant of.
Yeah. Several of the people that I chatted with about that chapter in addiction there are oftentimes emotional um, disturbances that are driving people to abuse drugs and alcohol. They're looking to escape and distract, and those would be
Mm,
unhealthy forms of avoidance.
mm,
Um, and to be clear, there are unhealthy forms of avoidance I talk about in the book. The emotional eating is a great example of the power of sensation and really the importance of understanding the effects that these tools can have on you and how to wield them, right? So a lot of people, like we just talked before about how powerful the senses can be for temporarily shifting our emotions, like the joy and blissfulness I experience when I have a refrigerated dark chocolate peanut butter cup after dinner. Mini dark chocolate. I love those. I mean, instantly makes me feel great. And so a lot of people are aware of this like experience that comes specifically from dark chocolate peanut butter cups. I'm joking. But like, we all have our these foods that just we love.
sure.
And it kind of makes sense that if you're feeling not great or you're stressed about something, that you might reach for a very quick jolt in the opposite direction by going to eating. Now, that, if taken to an extreme, can be dysfunctional, but in the right proportions, could be just fine too. So again, this is where just knowing how we work when it comes to our emotions, I think, can be so incredibly empowering. First, it like teaches us about something that is part of who we all are. Like, I find it amazing that we've all experienced emotions throughout our lives. And yet, when I ask people to just tell me what is an emotion, most of the room gets silent. Like, people just are not confident in themselves. That's wild to me, right? So we can define an emotion. We can identify the tools that exist to help us manage them. And I think simply knowing what those tools are and then starting the process of discovery to understand how do these tools fit in my life best? What are the ones that work best for me? I mean, that can have such enormous value. Like, I so value the fact that I I have plans. Like, I know what to do when I get triggered in some way. I know the first line of intervention, and that works 60% of the time, let's say. But if that doesn't work, I know what else to do. And I also know how to help other people when they come to me for the problems that they're grappling with. And that's just knowledge I am so incredibly grateful for and excited to share with others.
I love that you include the warning signs because you say most experiences have an emotional peak that will slope down over time, allowing us to gain distance from it. And you distract yourself for long enough to let time do its work. Resentment can be metabolized away. I love that sentence. But then you do give the warning signs. So, substance abuse, which I think in my case could include food, kind of, right? Or that's a food is a substance. I don't know why I'm so confused about this. Anyway, constantly seeking reassurance. If you keep thinking about it,
Yeah.
these different warning signs. So you're like, that's when,
Totally. So
you know,
it's here's the best way to I like to use the like a carpenter's toolbox as a metaphor. My grandfather was a carpenter, not the Holocaust one, um, the other side. Although he was in World War II too. Um, my grandfather would never show up to a work site number one with one tool. He wouldn't have a job, right? If he just brought a hammer, he would come with
they have so many tools.
yeah,
That's
exactly. They
such a
have a
good
whole
analogy.
right. So you come with a whole toolbox. But number two, my grandfather understood how to use those tools, when to use them and how. I remember when I was a kid, he gave me a hammer and I was just playing with it. I broke the hammer. The top, I like banged it too. I didn't know how to use a hammer and I caused destruction as a result. That metaphor, I think, applies really well to the shifters, these tools we're talking about. You need to have them, number one. Like you need to know where to find them. And then you need to understand how to use them. And the somewhat tricky thing, but also I think this could be an exciting thing, is that unlike the tools of a carpenter, where you can go to a trade school or apprentice and then just figure out right away when you have a certain kind of nail, you use this screwdriver,
Mhm.
that's going to differ for every person when to use the different tools and how much to use them. But I think I don't think that should be a bummer or surprising to anyone who's listening because I think most of us would agree that all of our emotional lives are distinct, right? Like our emotional lives are like fingerprints, utterly unique. My emotional life is very different, my emotional signature, if you will, than my wife, the person, the adult I'm closest to in this world. Our emotional lives are very, very different. So why would we expect the same solution to work for all of us? The science here is very, very clear. The same solutions don't work for all of us. So we've got to figure out the ones that do.
And you have so many ideas in this book shift. I wanted to throw out too that I had written this on a different page and I'm not sure why. But when you're talking about the emotional contagion, so you gave the example of sitting in the car with your daughter. That was my example too, right? Sitting in the car, you got a 20-minute drive, and you're
Yeah.
like, well, this person is
Yeah,
crabby.
let's put on like
What
yeah,
are we gonna do? But
that's
you
right.
said that it happens online as well.
Yeah, so emotional contagion can be a problem online. It can also be a force for good. I'll give
Yeah.
you two examples. Um, we're often online and we're going into these different social media applications where people are conveying their emotions, often in a very unfiltered way, right? Because there's little inhibition online, so we just kind of let it out. And so things happen, and then we register other people's emotions and we see it endlessly on our streams, and algorithms tend to select for more triggering kinds of posts. And so this is in part how you have these groundswells of groundswells is putting it too mildly, tidal waves of emotional contagion sweeping nations and countries in response to social events. Social media is playing a powerful role in causing those emotional upheavals. Now, that can be good or bad, right? It really depends on the context. It can lead to bullying and, just kind of like jumping on the bandwagon and beating up on people. It can also inspire collective action too. So again, it's good to know how this works because if you know how it works, I think you could be more resistant to it if you want to be, or you can lean in. But at least you have the informed understanding about how to have these social media forces affect you, which I think a lot of us don't have a lot of the time. We just find ourselves being pulled by it. Back to the subtitle. We have it managing us rather than the other way around. If you ask me, I don't want that to be the case. I want to be in the driver's seat. And sometimes I do want to lean into those collective emotional responses, and sometimes I don't. And this knowledge empowers me to have some agency about whether I do or don't.
It's so good. Speaking of the good, I want to hit this one last thing because I thought it was really applicable. The reason that I started 1,000 hours outside is because I added up at one point. There's a couple factors, but I added up how much time we had spent outside in the last year because we sort of had a little consistent thing that we were doing with some friends. And it, at the time, is about a little over a decade ago, it equaled the amount of time that kids were on screens in that year. And I just had this thought of how much fuller our life was. We always say we're not against screens, but it would have been such a different life experience had all those 1,000 hours gone to screen use instead of all of these things that we did outside. And when we go outside, like I have a pretty distinct memory of a ton of the things that we've done. We travel somewhere somewhat close by, and we come back again. And I remember that time, and it was super icy on that trail. And you kind of have these really distinct memories. And so you talked about that the more meaningful an experience is, the longer the emotions associated with it will last. So I'm assuming, I mean, that's obviously for things that are negative, but true also for things that are good, or that's at least what it seems like. The memories we form are stronger and reverberate in our awareness longer when they have an emotional tinge, often due to sensory experience. So my experience is that our time in nature has felt like it has expanded my life and how fulfilling it feels. And I remember so much. And so I felt like, oh, this was kind of the explanation of that.
Well, if they are more infused with emotion, that may well explain it for sure. Um, I would say your experience may not be the rule for everyone, though, in the sense that sometimes, for example, screen experiences can be quite emotional for folks, right?
True.
And sensory based too, with sound. And in fact, if you follow the evolution of social media applications, like it's the multimedia, multi-sensory experience of
Right.
social media that's increasingly being important to people. So I think you're going to see some variability there, but there are also some other factors about nature that I think help. That it's also pulling on some other sensory experiences, like even light, vision
Mm.
that we haven't talked about. It also gives us the opportunity to broaden our perspective around things by allowing us to experience awe that can be helpful. So, like, I want to be super clear. If you are finding getting outside to be more beneficial than staying on screens, you should keep doing
And I
that.
wouldn't even use the word beneficial. I would use the word memorable.
And memorable,
So,
all that
like,
good
it's
stuff.
like a year
Absolutely.
ago, it would be hard for me to say, a year ago, I played this video game, Ratchet and Clank, on the PS5. But if I was like, oh, but a year ago, because it's snowing, right? We were like both home with it's snow day. A year ago, we were building a fort out of snow with this like thing that we got, and it makes these big blocks. It's memorable. And so when you talked
Yeah.
about how the emotions can last longer and the memories can be stronger, that's sort of what my experience has been.
Well, and I think that's like for you, that was a little that's you've done the little self-experiment that I encourage folks to do at the end of the book, which is to try out these different tools.
Yeah.
And you have compared those kinds of nature experiences to the indoor ones and recognize the value they have for you and your family. And now you're choosing to do more of them. Like, that's great. That is the exact proof of principle. Now imagine you did that or other people did that with all of the different tools that I talk about in the book, like dozens of tools, right? So you're
Yeah.
self-experimenting, you're finding the right combinations that benefit you most, and then guess what? You're actually having a better life. That makes me really happy if that's the outcome, because that was the goal behind the book, to give people the knowledge to lead those better, more emotionally fit lives.
Yeah, you hit the goal for sure. The book is Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You. I also highly recommend Chatter. This book is already for sale now, so you can get your copy wherever books are sold. I want to end it with a sentence from your grandma. She talked about how why is a crooked letter. We're always asking why. Why did this happen? Why did that happen? And you said you interpreted that as sometimes there are no answers, and searching for them only creates suffering. And sometimes you do search for them, right? That's what you're talking about. It's unique for people. But sometimes searching for them only creates suffering. Leave it alone. Finish your homework, ride your bike with your friends. Cherish the life you have. What a book, Ethan. I loved it so
Thanks
much.
so
I got so much
thanks so
out of it.
much, Ginny.
You just have been traveling and traveling and traveling. What an honor to get this time with you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's an honor to be here as always. Thanks for having me.